We reject the ideology of globalism, and we embrace the doctrine of globalism, and we embrace the doctrine of patriotism.
Not only will this tax plan pay for itself, but it will pay down debt.
There are moral and legal obligation questions that I think we'll have to wrestle with as a society.
When we go wobbly on the truth, we go wobbly on America.
All you have to do is look at the numbers, look at what we've done.
And this is only the beginning.
From 100.9 FM WXIR, this is Evidence of Design, and I'm your host, Jason Taylor. Evidence of Design is a live talk show about the political economy. We critique income and wealth inequality and support democratic values. Thank you for listening, and welcome. Instructions to the Cook by Bernie Glassman and Rick Fields. When we first started the bakery, everybody who worked there was a Zen student. As time went on, we would periodically hire someone who wasn't a Zen student, but who was a professional baker. It seemed that we had hit the limit of our experience, and we needed someone who had the knowledge we could learn from. It was useful, of course, but one of the keys to our success, it turned out, was that we were amateurs. Since we really didn't have a thorough knowledge of baking, we experimented in non-professional ways. We tried things that normal bakers wouldn't even have thought of trying. We created some things that were unusual for the trade, and they made their mark.
The pop group, She's Beyond Good and Evil.
And welcome to Evidence of Design, folks. This is episode 51. Thanks for tuning in to 100.9 FM WXIR, or if you're listening online at www.1009wxir.com, welcome as well, or on the TuneIn app. My name is Jason Taylor, and I'm your host of Evidence of Design, joined by my good friend and co-host,
Matt Treadwell.
There it is. So today, folks, we are talking about expertise on evidence of design. What does it mean to be an expert on something, and what does it mean to know something? We're coming at this from the angle and from the assumption that expertise is under assault in modern America. That is perhaps a subjective statement we're coming at, but we have this feeling, Matt and I, that kind of knowledge or expertise on a certain fact, figure, or idea is under assault. People are less trustworthy of institutions and so-called experts. Of course, we can cue in terms such as fake news, alternative facts, the elite. Those types of things are examples of what I think is an assault on expertise or knowledge in some ways.
I think as people more and more seem to equate opinions with facts, what we're seeing is when people present information, such as an example we're going to be getting to soon on climate change, they feel that if they just disagree with those findings, that their own feelings hold the same weight as, say, scientific findings.
Right. Feelings is not knowledge. Opinions aren't necessarily knowledge, and there's nothing wrong with opinions, but they shouldn't ever substitute for knowledge. And so on today's show, we want to hear from you. What do you think you're an expert on, if anything? What do you feel like? Do you feel like your voice in a certain topic outweighs the voices of others, which is fine? Do you feel like when you have to talk about a certain thing that you kind of have more credence to do so? Or if not, when do you think not being expert is actually beneficial? We're going to get that into the second half of the hour, where Matt and I have some ideas of when you're not really too knowledgeable about something that actually could be beneficial. And so you can participate in a number of ways. First and foremost, 585-219-8889. We are live for you today on this Saturday, April 14th, I believe. Is it the 13th? It's the 13th. Saturday, April 13th. We are live for you. 585-219-8889. Twitter at Radio EOD. Email radioeod@gmail.com. And Facebook, Radio EOD. Matt, let's jump into things talking about expertise, especially in related to climate change. And why we focus on climate change is because there's been quite a bit in the news, of course, about climate change. We actually covered climate change in a full episode, I would say around episode 30. So it was
back
end
in
of
November,
last year. Yeah.
December.
The end of last year. Climate change, of course, is, I believe, one of the most important issues of our time. It is perhaps existential to humanity. And there's been quite a bit in the news this week about climate change, and we'll play some clips about that. But let's remind listeners kind of where we are. Just since October of last year about climate change, there are a number of milestone reports that came out. In October of last year, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a report that said, we got to do something about it as an international community right now. And not only that, but they actually reassessed their findings and said that, instead of holding the global temperatures below a rise of 2 degrees Celsius, which is 3 degrees Fahrenheit, they were actually saying we need to actually set our targets. We need to be more stringent with our targets because we can't let global temperatures rise more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. So that sounds small, but even a global average temperature rise of 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit could have catastrophic changes to our planet.
And we're on track to hit that in the next decades or so?
Yeah, yep. By 2100, by the year 2100, within the century, we will surpass those temperature rises unless drastic change is taken. And so that was in October, that UN Intergovernmental Panel. In November of last year, which is kind of the spark for our coverage of climate change, the 4th National Climate Assessment Report was released by the U.S. government, and that report essentially echoed the findings of the UN reports, but really focusing on the U.S. and looking at the effects that climate change would have on our country and some things that we could do to tackle climate change. It was pretty dire warnings.
And it was commissioned by the Trump administration.
Well, yeah, it's a report that happens not annually, every so often by law. And it just happens that the Trump administration is in power. So, yeah, right.
And he has disputed those findings.
Yep, he's disputed the findings of all of these reports. And, of course, Trump is a climate change denialist who does not believe in climate change, or at least that climate change is man-made, or at least that climate change is bad.
At least publicly.
Yeah. Who knows what he believes personally, but yeah, Trump is not a friend of climate change, of course. And so in December of last year, also, there was a conference of parties on the UN Framework of Convention on Climate Change. Long story short, that basically means that all the leaders or experts in the countries around the world got together and actually started to track down various metrics of how you could measure the Paris Climate Accord and how countries could have a unilateral way to measure their means by which they could reduce carbon emissions and reduce global temperature rises. So it's creating a standardized framework for measuring climate change, which is really important because if you have 190 countries on the world, you'd have 190 different ways to measure climate change. But Matt, that is all old news that we've covered in the past. New news about climate change in terms of, there's plenty of news out there, but we're just covering kind of major milestone reports. In January of this year, the Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coats, released the annual the National Intelligence Threat Assessment, and climate change was assessed as one of those major threats to the United States, in addition to things like nuclear proliferation, terrorism, cyber warfare. Climate change is one of them. This is coming from the Director of National Intelligence who oversees the NSA, the CIA, all of those organizations. Trump came out and said, yeah, not so much. I don't really believe in that national threat assessment coming from the intelligence community and, the scientific community and every other community. I'm going to start my own White House panel to determine whether or not climate change poses a national security risk to the United States.
It's rare that Trump would disagree with the intelligence committee or community for the United States.
Is that sarcasm, Matt?
Oh, Jason.
Right. Trump has infamously not believed his own intelligence community time and time again, especially related to Russian interference in the U.S. election. He is the only president I ever have heard examples from who gets intelligence reports from his own intelligence agencies and just simply chooses not to believe them. A little weird.
But moving on. And
so this was big news. So February 20th, Trump is like, look, I don't care about any of these reports that I just read, right? October, major UN report. November, major U.S. government report. December, major UN panel. January, major report from U.S. National Intelligence. Trump says...
I think you're giving him a lot of credit to say that he read this.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Trump doesn't believe in any of them. I'm going to establish my own White House panel to see what's going on with this climate change thing. Guess who was going to head that panel, Matt?
William Happel.
Yes, William Happer. He is a climate change denialist. He happens to have a PhD in physics or something. He teaches at Princeton, and he was going to head that panel. He was appointed by Trump to the National Security Council. Let's hear, Matt, what William Happer had to say about some things related to climate.
Should we be really concerned about CO2, and what do you think?
Well, no, actually CO2 will be good for the Earth. If you look at geological history, CO2 levels are unusually low now. It's very seldom that they've been this low for the last 600 million years or so. And so many plants are not growing as well as they could if they had more CO2. So CO2 by itself will be very good for the Earth. More will be a good thing.
So that's William Happer, the guy who's going to lead the presidential committee on wondering whether or not climate change is a problem, saying CO2 is a good thing for the planet. Our CO2 levels are the lowest they've been in 600 a lot of years.
600 million years.
A billion years, yeah.
There was a billion?
I don't know. A long time. I'd have to listen to it again. But
I think it was a million. 600 billion years. The sun's only 4.9 billion years old.
You're an expert on this, Matt, clearly. But so here's a PhD scientist talking about the fact that CO2, not so bad for the climate. What do you think, Matt?
I mean, he's the expert.
Is he?
I don't know.
Yeah. So why would you say he's the expert?
Well, he's a physicist, right?
Yep. Is a physicist, what does physics have to do with climate change?
I don't know.
I'm not sure either. And so I'm sure that there are relationships between physics and climate change, but I'm just saying when we get into our discussion about expertise, this guy's got a PhD.
Yeah.
He's a leading physicist who did a lot of work with the defense community on lasers and missile defense systems, and now he's sort of going to lead the presidential panel on climate change. And so I think that if you're a member of the right or climate change denialist, you can look at a gentleman like William Happer and say, he's a smart guy. He's got a PhD. He's an expert. But of course, we know that like 99% of the scientific community thinks that levels of CO2 produced by humans, anthropocentric climate change, is a problem for humanity. And so why does this all matter is because there was a really revealing exchange this week between a House of Representatives member, Thomas Massie from West Virginia, and John Kerry, former Secretary of State, relating to climate change. Folks, you have to listen to this, and we'll be talking about this exchange and talking about what it means to know something and be an expert. The fact of the matter is that climate change is happening. Human-induced climate change is happening if you believe the scientific community, and it's a problem and we should do something about it. And there's no there about whether or not human-induced climate change is an issue. But let's hear what this gentleman had to say. Matt, let's hear the first thing. This is an exchange between Thomas Massie and John Kerry on Tuesday of this week.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Kerry, I want to read part of your statement back to you. Instead of convening a kangaroo court, the president might want to talk with the educated adults he once trusted to fill his top national security positions. It sounds like you're questioning the credentials of the president's advisors currently, but I don't think we should question your credentials today. Isn't it true you have a science degree from Yale? What's that?
Bachelor of Arts degree.
Is it a political science degree?
Yes, political science.
So how do you get a Bachelor of Arts in a science?
Arts education and degree, it's a bachelor.
Okay, so it's not really science. So I think it's somewhat appropriate that somebody with a pseudoscience degree is here pushing pseudoscience in front of our committee today. I want to ask you...
Are you serious? I mean, this is really serious happening here?
You know what? It is serious. You're calling the president's cabinet a kangaroo court. Is that serious?
I'm not calling his cabinet a kangaroo court. I'm calling this committee that he's putting together a kangaroo committee.
What are you saying, that he doesn't have educated adults there now?
I don't know who it has yet because it's secret.
Well, you said it in your testimony.
Why would he have to have a secret analysis of climate change?
Let me ask you.
Why does the president
let's get back
to keep
to the
it
science
secret?
of it. Let's get back to the science of it.
But it's not science. You're not quoting science.
Well, you're the science expert. You got the political science degree.
Ouch. That was Thomas Massie this week, a House Representatives member from West Virginia, questioning John Kerry, former Secretary of State, on a House of Representatives convene. So the House of Representatives has various committees. This is the House Committee on Oversight Reform. It's Democratic-led. The Democrats have this committee to figure out to what extent climate change is hurting national security and what can we do about it. So they called Secretary Kerry and also, what's the gentleman's name? They called Secretary Kerry and Chuck Hagel, the former Secretary of Defense, to testify in front of this committee because both of them are a member of an organization that leads the threat assessments against climate change. And you heard in that exchange there Thomas Massie questioning John Kerry's credentials and whether or not the consensus on climate change is actually based upon, well, science. Matt, did you get anything out of that conversation?
It just felt like... what's the Republican representative's name? I'm sorry.
Tom Massie.
It just felt like he was really trying to lead the conversation and steer it in a way that made John Kerry seem very uncredible. But he just did such a poor job of it that he just came across as petty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he starts out with the idea of what's your degree? Okay, you have a political science degree, but how come you have a Bachelor of Arts and not a Bachelor of Science? Well,
I don't even know to begin. I have a bachelor's degree and I study English, and it's a bachelor's of science. And the only reason why I have a bachelor's of science degree and not a bachelor's of arts degree is because the school that I went to made the distinction that if I wanted a bachelor's of arts degree, I had to get a language credit, and I chose not to.
I didn't even know that. Wow.
Yeah.
And I have a Bachelor of Arts in International Studies, and so, you know.
Well, I mean, yeah. I don't.
Yeah.
I assume that Mr. Massie has been to college at some point because he's a member of the elite, as we like to say.
The House of Representatives.
So he knows the distinction.
Yeah.
It's just pointless semantics.
Yeah, and so pseudoscience talking about pseudoscience, you know, it's really quite sad. This is an elected member of the United States government. Thomas Massie is no fringe person. He's from West Virginia. He's one of the 400 plus members of the House of Reps representing the American people, and this is what he's doing with his time. And so, listeners, if you're just tuning in to 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester, New York, we welcome you to Evidence of Design. We're talking about expertise today, particularly related to climate change, and we're wanting to hear from you. We're wanting to hear from you throughout the show on what you're an expert on, and, well, do you think that they know too much, or that they don't allow you to really express what you feel about things, or do you feel like we're too unfair on expertise nowadays, and we should actually give more credence to those who are experts in things? You can participate in a number of ways. 585-219 8889, 585-219-8889. We were just hearing from Thomas Massie, a U.S. House of Representatives member, questioning John Kerry this week on climate change. Matt, let's play one more clip. This is the third clip. I'm sorry, this is clip number 4 for you, Matt. This is again Thomas Massie questioning Secretary of State Kerry today. This is a very revealing exchange I found. Let's hear it.
Secretary Kerry, what is you avoided my colleague's question about how do you pay for it, but I want to ask, what is your solution to comply with the Paris Accord requirements? Like, what would you do?
I beg to differ with you. I did not avoid the question. I said there are many ways to pay for it.
He just asked for one.
Well, I did. I talked about the carbon pricing is one way to pay for change. There are all kinds of other things we could do. One would be to not give $1 trillion worth of tax benefits to the top 1% of Americans. I'm one of them. I didn't deserve to get that tax cut. Nobody did in this country, at the expense of average folks who can't make ends meet. So that would be a fair way to start.
You don't want to politicize this, but you just played the 1% card.
No, I actually played a moral judgment about what is appropriate in building a civil society.
Well,
That's what
my
did.
colleague Comer of Kentucky knows is that this will fall on the poorest of the poor. It's raise the price of energy in Kentucky or Massachusetts or Pennsylvania or France or wherever, whichever house you're staying in.
That is absolutely incorrect that it would fall on the poorest people, because if you do it right, which hasn't been done here for a little while, if you look at the tax legislation, there are all kinds of ways to make sure that people at the bottom end, people struggling to get into the middle class, can be rewarded. And that's not what's happened. If you look at the distribution, we have the most unequal distribution of income in America that we've had since the 1920s, when we didn't have an income tax. We have a country in which 51% of America's income is going to 1% of Americans. That is not a sustainable political equation.
We have a country. If you want to use 1920 as the benchmark,
the gentleman's time has expired.
People in this country are far better.
The gentleman's time has expired.
I might be a John Kerry fan now.
Yeah, why do you say that, Matt?
I don't know. Just it's nice to hear somebody who's so well entrenched in the fabric, or at least was, of American politics, of mainstream American politics, talking about wealth inequality.
Yeah, and what did you think about him so-called playing the 1% card? Did you get anything from Massie on that, or how did that make you feel?
I thought it was just, it's so clearly a naked attempt by Massie to politicize this whole discussion by having a freaking argument on climate change, which the scientific community is largely in agreement on. You do have people like this William Happer individual who are on the fringe and who disagree and do possess expertise. But when you have 99% of the scientific community saying, A, climate change is occurring, B, it's occurring because of human activity, specifically the consumption of fossil fuels, and C, that the effects of climate change will have drastic effects on the way our society operates and the way we live our lives in the next 100 years and onward if we don't take drastic measures in order to curb those emissions. It's just, I don't even know what else to say. It's such a poor, a deflection to call out John Kerry for playing the 1% card.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's mind-boggling how disingenuous and just destructive this is. Let's not kid ourselves. The Republican Party is the last major political party on earth that doesn't believe in climate change. Like, the entire international community of 7.5 billion people on this planet, the vast majority of those people in all 190 plus countries in the world think that climate change is an issue and that we should do something about it. But for whatever reason, the Republican Party doesn't think it's an issue. And I can't for the life of me understand why. What is the reason why you wouldn't want to change climate change? You could think that, I don't want coal jobs to leave. And I think that's where Thomas Massie's coming from. He's coming from West Virginia. There's a lot of coal miners there. I think for him, he just gets a lot of money from the coal industry. I don't know this. I'm not doing a conspiracy theory. I don't know. But, that's the only reason I can think of, is that you get a lot of money from the fossil fuel industry, because guess what? Back in the 1980s, the fossil fuel industry was the industry that invented climate change denialism. And they fomented fake news, essentially fake opposition research against climate change. And here we are 40 years later, thanks to the fossil fuel industry, where half of the American public essentially doesn't either believe in climate change or think that human-induced climate change is a problem because of the wealthy elite in the fossil fuel industry did a bunch of opposition research against it.
And we have numerous examples of other industries pulling the same kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Look at the tobacco industry.
Right. Sugar, too.
Yeah.
And guess what? The pharmaceutical industry with opioids. It happens time and time again where these massive industries want to make money off of your life.
Whenever money is at stake, truth will be discarded.
Yep. Absolutely. And so it's just really disgusting to me what they were all alluding to, why John Kerry was saying the Trump administration is doing some shadowy program on this, is because, as we mentioned, that presidential committee that Trump proposed on February 20th of this year, the Presidential Committee on Climate Security, that physicist William Happer was supposed to lead, well, there was so much bipartisan backlash against that, at least from retired experts in the field, both military generals, both folks from the intelligence community, both politicians, all saying that no, climate change is going to hurt American interests and national security. Not even talking about like a bigger issue of humanity and green earth and things like that. They were just like, this is going to hurt America. And so you can't do this, Mr. President. And so Trump has canceled his plan to create a presidential committee on climate security, but instead the National Security Council now, the leading council of the intelligence community in the United States government, is going to be doing a shadowy opposition research against climate change now, and they're going to continue on with the opposition, but not as public as they were going to do. So they're going to be producing assessments that say that climate change isn't much of an issue as it really is, because of folks like William Happer who think that our plants aren't growing as much as they could be because there's not enough CO2 in the atmosphere. So it makes absolutely no sense. And when we're talking about expertise, I think that we should not confuse the fact that 99% of the scientific community believes that climate change is happening, period. So I think that exchange today, if you that exchange we just heard between Thomas Massie and John Kerry is very, very revealing, if nothing else, about the split between the Democrats and Republicans, but just about some of the rhetoric going on in terms of questioning expertise and fomenting essentially alternative facts.
Yes. I have so much more that I could say about the whole, let's not politicize this statement. But
yeah, what do you think?
Just that, like, this is this is government, and we're not going to politicize this. We're not going to bring politics into this government.
Right.
Hearing that we're having.
We're not going to bring government into governing. It's like, what?
It's a very conservative position to take.
It is very. And so I'd like to turn our attention now to an article written by Adam Frank. He's actually a local astrophysicist who works at the University of Rochester. He's fairly well known. He writes articles on NPR nationally. And he wrote an article in April 2017. This really struck me when I read it. Again, put ourselves back in April 2017. It was right after Donald Trump was inaugurated as president. It was a little longer after the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union, known as Brexit. And so there's a lot of stuff going on where it's like there were threads in the media and on social media of saying, I'm tired of experts and the elite kicking me around and telling me what to do. Sure. I want to live my own life. And so then Adam Frank wrote an article in NPR called Why Expertise Matters. It came out in April 2017. And there was a great quote from that article, Matt, I wanted to read here. And it goes, if you have really studied something and really gone deep into how it works, then you should come away knowing how much you don't know. In a sense, that is the real definition of an expert, knowing the limits of one's own knowledge. And so that really identifies with me for a number of reasons, and one of them is that I think that a lot of folks who are climate change denialists, you see them on news articles when they in the comment section or on YouTube or when they call into radio talk shows like ours. A lot of times they will be talking.
Well,
yeah, 585-219-8889. If you don't believe in climate change, bring it on. 585-219-8889. A lot of folks will say that well, this is a natural geological occurrence that happens over time. And then it's like, so what do you do for a living? And it's like, well, I am an electrician.
I'm an armchair philosopher.
Yeah. And it's like, you know, that's fine. Like, you can have opinions on things, but I don't understand why you think that you know what's going on in the scientific community because you've read one right-wing article about it.
Yeah. Just like, I remember this doesn't have anything to do with climate change, but it does relate to the whole equating feelings with facts sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I remember, I don't remember who this individual was, but I remember watching a clip on a news program, and they played a video of a guy, I think it was like the New Year's celebration in New York City, and they just had this guy who's like, yeah, I just believe in my heart that President Obama, or Obama was president at the time, I just believe that President Obama is a Muslim. And it was like, so many things to unpack there. One, he's not. Two, if he was, who cares? You know, three, it's none of our business. But it was going back, I think, in some ways tying back to that whole birther conspiracy that Donald Trump played such a large role in starting and keeping alive for so many years. And it's just this constant just refusal to accept basic truths about reality. Things that have been largely accepted by everybody else, or not everybody else, but by a large swath of people, by a majority of people. And for what?
Right. Yeah, that's what I'm wondering too. For what? Why deny climate change?
I think part of it, I mean, if we're going to talk about, we've talked about, you've mentioned that some of the reasons why, you know, people with a stake in fossil fuel industries would want to. Of course, they have money at stake. Another reason, I think, for perhaps more everyday people would be the loss of job opportunities. There's a lot of people, I mean, people know by now, they know that coal mining is dangerous for you. It's a bad job for your health. And there's been a lot of research and news stories recently about the effects of silica dust and a even more sort of debilitating version of black lung disease in Appalachia. But people still do it because I think a lot of the reason why is there's a sense of pride, because it runs in the family, because they don't feel like they have any other choice to make. And so I think a large fear for a lot of people is that if we accept climate change as basic reality, as something that is happening and something that we must do something about, that means that my opportunities for employment are going to disappear. And I think that part of the reason why a lot of people might feel that way is because the people who have a stake in this monetarily, meaning the people who, you know, control these large fossil fuel industries, or, you know, are part of the boardroom meetings or whatever, they have done such, they have campaigned this idea that there's nothing else to be done, that we couldn't be spending money, you know, investing in programs to help give people who lack these economic opportunities training to do something else. Say, as computer engineers or whatever, as coders. But we created this problem. We define. We are contributing to this problem. We are defining climate change, and we can change it if we all make the effort.
Yeah, there's a lot there, Matt. I think that's very well said. I think the idea that everyday Americans who might be climate change denialists, there's sort of a rational implication where it's like, well, I don't want to lose my job. But I think there's a more powerful one where it's just an attack on their identity. And when Thomas Massie, the House of Representatives Republican from West Virginia, is saying, well, don't politicize climate change, it's like the Republican Party has been the one that's politicized climate change for 30 years. And I totally echo what you're saying, Matt, where it's like, I don't want people to lose their jobs. I'm not saying, like, don't mine coal anymore. Obviously, you have to do some work some way to make ends meet. But you know what would be a really good alternative option? Is the U.S. government funding programs for alternative green energy So those people who are doing coal can get a new job in that industry, be trained for it, and develop a new identity around green energy that literally doesn't kill them, because if you go work in a coal mine, you literally die because of it, and you do something that saves the planet. So you save your life, you save your planet, it's a new job, new identity, great. The problem is that the Conservative Party, and even the Democrats too, have for a long time said, well, we don't want the government to be too strong. We don't want the government to spend stuff on social programs because the free market is the best way to do things. And so you have this horrible amalgamation, this stewing pot of stupidity where the government shouldn't get involved. Is climate change real or not? We don't have the political capital or the economic capital or the social capital to do anything about it. And all of this gets to what I'd like to chat about next, is something called a wicked problem. For those who are just joining us, though, this is Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester, New York. If you're listening at www.1009wxir.com, thanks for tuning in there. Thanks for tuning in there as well, or at the TuneIn app. We are talking about expertise today, Matt and I. You can participate in a number of ways. 585-219-8889, 585-219-8889, or radioeod@gmail.com, or at Twitter at radioeod. Interrupt us at any time, 585-219-8889. That is all right. Now, I want to talk about the notion of a wicked problem briefly, and this is just a theoretical framework or an idea I thought would be helpful to this conversation. It was kind of popularized or created by two scholars known as Horst Riddle and Melvin Weber in a 1973 article they wrote called Dilemmas in General Theory of Planning. If you're interested in reading academic articles, there you go. If not, break it down for you here with the idea of a wicked problem. So for these folks, Riddle and Weber, they're thinking about big, giant social policy. How do people make social policy and public policy decisions? And they have this notion of like a wicked problem. And this is a problem where there's no definitive solution or even formulation to it, because it can manifest differently in different places, and you can't really completely isolate a variable. So in the sciences, the idea is that you isolate certain variables so you can really get down to saying this is cause and this is effect.
Test one thing at a time.
Exactly. For these big public social policy problems, or as they called it, wicked problems, there's no real way to isolate variables because the problems are overlapped with so many other areas. For example, poverty overlaps with education, nutrition, physical health, mental health, civic participation, safety,
institutional racism,
exactly, gender bias, and on and on and on. So an issue like poverty is what you could call a wicked problem, because poverty in America looks different than poverty in Rwanda or poverty in Russia and poverty in New Zealand, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So poverty itself, it's a problem. It exists all over the place, but it manifests differently. And to solve poverty, you can't just do one magic solution because it overlaps with so many other areas. And therefore, with wicked problems, there are ways you can improve the problems, but you can't really completely solve them. At some point, perhaps we might be able to get rid of poverty, but for public policymakers, you kind of have to think of what can we do to improve things, not solve things. And one of the hardest things about these wicked problems is that it's hard to, again, because you can't really isolate variables to solve them, you have to kind of solve them, as the saying goes, while you're building a plane while flying it. So you have to kind of solve it on the fly, but interventions to these problems are often very large and costly, and if you retry them, then you're almost retrying something in new environments and circumstances that make it a different manifestation of the same problem, if that makes any sense. So for example, if poverty is a wicked problem, you can look at universal basic income as one proposed betterment to poverty, right? And so there are localities around that are testing out universal basic income. So let's say those localities test out universal basic income, seems to have positive effects on people living there. The tricky thing is that it's impacted in so many other ways in so many other areas, it's hard to do just one sort of widespread solution to it. And so what all this is to say is that if we're living in a democracy that is really struggling to believe in expertise or to have, the same understandings of underlying facts, solving wicked problems are going to be very, very hard, if not possible. such as climate change. How can we ever get to a place to solve climate change if we are living in a society where there are certain people or political parties or groups who simply don't want to believe in underlying basic facts? And you're never going to build up the political, economic, or social capital to make the decisions, the democratic decisions necessary to take the proactive steps to improving those problems, if not solving them, right? And that's where I think we are today, where the government is so gridlocked and all the rest of it is because of a variety of combinations of blaming the government for a long time, of a variety of combinations of making income and wealth inequality worse, of people not trusting in democratic institutions and not trusting in what is known as expertise. And so here we are in Evidence of Design, trying to come up with improvements.
In the next 20 minutes, we'll solve poverty and climate change.
Yes. But Matt, maybe, perhaps, folks, you're welcome to participate. 585-219, 585-219-8889. Let's pivot now, I think. And
sure.
I hope that for what we've heard from the show so far, we're talking about expertise. We don't think, Matt and I, that's good that expertise has been vilified. In general, expertise is a good thing because, people spend a lot of time in both education and experience to get expertise. Education plus experience equals expertise.
But the quote that you opened with sort of suggested that we also wanted to take a look at when expertise might actually get in the way of or be a hindrance to some other forms of pursuit.
Right. And so let's go to that other side. We're not going to the other side of the aisle now, so to speak. We're just wondering, okay, maybe you don't like expertise so much. Well, I'm not saying it's okay to not like expertise because you don't believe in facts. I don't think that matters. But when is there, Matt? When is it okay, or when is it actually beneficial to not have expertise in something? Are there examples of that that's not just like, I don't believe in this fact? What do you think?
I think there are. And I think the obvious sort of place to turn to is art. We have numerous examples throughout history of people who either lacked a traditional education in whatever art form that they pursued, or reached a point where they decided to stop paying attention to that education and to break rules. And it's led to, in many cases, the establishment of new genres, of new art forms even. And, art is not climate change. Art is not based on, I'm not going to say that. Art is not climate change. So there's not the same level of responsibility in adhering to certain rules in practicing an art than there are in sort of practicing science. And I'm not trying to suggest that there is. But if we turn to an example, one of my favorite bands that I've been listening to a lot lately is a band called This Heat. They were a post-punk band from England that were active between 1976 and 1982, and they were composed of three members: Charles Hayward, Charles Bullen, and Gareth Williams. A brief history, just so that I can sort of explain, and this will make sense to everybody where I'm going with this. Charles Bullen and Charles Hayward knew each other previously. They had performed in a couple of projects together, namely an improvisational group composed of only the two of them called Dolphin Logic, where they would just play. They had no set songs or anything. They would just show up to gigs and play whatever they felt like. Bullen and Hayward were both fairly accomplished musicians, even early in life. Charles Hayward sort of, not famously, but perhaps notably, drummed on a record called Quiet Sun that was Phil Manzarek also played on that record. And Phil Manzarek, for those who don't know, went on to play in Roxy Music with a certain Brian Eno, who has been hugely influential over the shape of rock music, ambient music over the last 40 years. So Bullen and Hayward had a lot of musical expertise. But the idea of this heat didn't really take off until they met Gareth Williams. And Gareth Williams was this sort of non-musician. In fact, he prided himself and called himself he described himself as a non-musician. He didn't play an instrument when he met Bullen and Hayward. And I believe he worked at a record store and was in art school at the time. But in every single interview that I've read with Bullen and Hayward, and unfortunately Gareth Williams passed away in 2001, I believe, of some form of cancer. In every interview I've read with Bullen and Hayward, they have cited how crucial and how critical Gareth Williams' involvement was, that the sort of sound that they were trying to go after with this heat didn't really start to coalesce until they had brought in somebody who didn't have the sort of expertise or training that they had built up over the years. And interestingly, in one particular interview that I read, they actually said that they sort of started to lose something, some connection to folk or outsider art, as I would call it, once Gareth, after performing with the band for so long, started to develop his own musical expertise. And if I could just illustrate, I'd like to play a clip from a song. This song is called A New Kind of Water. It's off the album Deceit. All of the musicians in this heat were multi-instrumentalists. So in any given track, one person could be playing clarinet, viola, messing around with tape delay, guitar. But in general, Charles Hayward would typically play drums, Charles Bullen would play guitar, and Gareth Williams would play bass or organ. So in this track, Gareth Williams is playing bass, and I don't know if this will illustrate anything for anybody, but just pay attention, if you can, to the bass notes. So again, that was a quick clip from A New Kind of Water by This Heat off their 1981 album Deceit. I don't know if that was apparent to anybody paying attention, but could you maybe pick up anything, Jason, out of that?
My ears are so well attuned to music, Matt. I heard a lot of, is syncopation the right word? Non-syncopated bass lines.
Yeah.
So they were kind of erratic, and yes. I'm an expert.
So it is, it doesn't feel, it's not simple in the sense that it's the same thing over and over again. It's changing, it's shifting, but it's also all very tight and in time with itself, and you can tell that the bass is responding, or is keeping along with the drums perfectly. And so even a person like Gareth Williams, who sort of prided himself on being a non-musician, after 5 years, you could see how he had become very accomplished and developed an expertise of his own in his own right. And I think it is one of the most interesting things that I have read about this band, and going back to the point that I made earlier, is that there was something that they began to lose, this connection to the original idea of what they wanted to do with this heat as Gareth began to develop expertise.
And the song we just heard was an example where you think they still had that sort of magic formula going on? Well,
I enjoy most of the band's music across its entire lifetime. I don't know that I agree that, but I do agree that it has, at that point, become much more that Gareth had become much more accomplished in a virtuosic sense, and that perhaps that there is something missing. There is an element of like well, I don't want to say that because of that they've lost connection to the sort of feeling or message that they're trying to establish with their music. But it's not a song that anybody could just pick up and play, you know. It doesn't, and not to say that not having expertise means that anybody could just pick it up and play a song that, you know, that this Heat wrote earlier in their lifetime. But it doesn't have that same element of whatever it is that allows somebody to just channel something without musical experience.
There's this idea of coming at a task, not being an expert at it through the arts. Does that resonate with you in your own work as a musician?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not somebody who really knows anything about
music theory.
Yes. Music theory, modes, keys, any of that sort of thing. I have a very basic knowledge about it, and much of it is not even things I can really describe using the vernacular, or the vocabulary rather. It's just sort of an intuitive thing that I've picked up after playing an instrument for 7 years now. And I do have a bit of a complex about that, I think, in that I worry sometimes that not having a more traditional background in music has sort of hampered my development, or is a crutch or an obstacle that I need to overcome. But I also think that for as much as it has limited me, it has also defined me, and I think that I am overall pleased that I didn't choose to study something more practical or perhaps more relevant to pursuing music, and that I have just chosen to sort of figure it out on my own.
And that has somehow allowed you to create music that is both meaningful to you and something that you feel proud of, and something that you think is different than what other people are producing who might have more of a formal training in music theory, perhaps?
Yeah, I have a really good friend named Sam Snyder. He's a local musician, but he plays in a bunch of bands, and he has said that I know that he's told me that there's, as much as I envy his ability to play, because he's a very virtuosic and accomplished musician and instrumentalist, he said that there's something enviable about the way that I play, and that it's not something that comes naturally to him simply because our backgrounds in music are different. And so I've tried in the past year or so to feel more, I guess, sort of grateful for my circumstances.
Are you worried at all that as you continue to play music, you will somehow become an expert, or so-called on the inside, and you will lose a feeling of speciality or sort of magic that you can use to create music?
No, I'm not. I think that that's and if I continue to pursue it, that will inevitably happen, and I will develop my own sort of version or form of expertise. And I think that that's just part of it, and I hope that I'm able to document how I change and grow throughout my life.
We started out the hour reading a quote from a book called Instructions to the Cook. It's by the authors Bernie Glassman and Rick Fields. And the quote basically talked about these folks who started a Zen Buddhist center in New York City, and they needed to have some way to make money, and they wanted to do it in a beneficial way that doesn't hurt people or rip people off, and so they decided to bake. And they basically baked pastries. And when they knew nothing about baking pastries, they hired people who had zero skills in it because they wanted to provide jobs for folks who, well, had no skills. And so it was entry level. And they made pastries that a lot of people enjoyed because they write, as the quote said, there was something special about the pastries they made. And in fact, they had a lot of contracts with other organizations, such as, a chocolate company that I can't remember the name of right now.
Hershey.
But it wasn't Hershey, but some chocolate company. But long story short, they had these contracts with other companies to sell them their pastries. And when they actually brought in expert chefs, pastry chefs, to help them bake, those companies wrote back and said, did you change your recipe? What's going on? We don't like this product that you're putting out now. And they got similar complaints from their customers too. And I just found that very interesting because you would think that bringing in an expert pastry chef would somehow, boost your cooking, and it did to some regards. They were able to produce things more efficiently. They were able to produce more of the same good, but it changed something about it that their customers and the companies who worked with them said removed the speciality, whatever it was, to their work.
One of the things that really struck me in that quote is, I don't know if you read it, but I've read a larger version of that quote, is that they talk about how they put an emphasis on the appearance of the desserts that they made, and how it was something that a lot of other sort of experts that they brought in neglected. And I think that is such a wonderful example of how a lack of expertise can lead somebody to consider things that people who are experienced in the field aren't even considering.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think I see this too in the field of education, where I work in the field of education, study in the field of education, and I love education. And I came to the field kind of from perhaps a different background from most folks. I didn't really want to be expressly a teacher, and I didn't have an undergraduate degree in education at all. And so I felt like I was somewhat an outsider to the work, and that I brought a different perspective on things from my peers who come from families who were always teachers, and they always knew they wanted to be teachers, and things of that nature. And so I've always felt that too, and try to think about it. It's like, I just see myself thinking and perceiving things differently than folks who you could say are professional or career educators. And there's a lot of examples that we don't really have time to get into right now, but there's something here, and this is why we wanted to have this conversation about approaching the arts or a particular field, not being an expert in it, allows you to see something in a different way that might be useful. Did you want to add something, Matt?
I just wanted to quickly amend that the reason why paying attention to the appearance of the pastries was important is because it helped give them an identity that was appreciated by customers. So that was why it was a boon to them. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that was clear in what I originally said, but
sure. And so I want to end with a strong distinction where it's like when you're talking about something like climate change, having an outside perspective isn't necessarily the best thing if you're just like an every average ordinary person who reads some news articles. I think we as people have to give trust. This is what it costs living in a civil society. We have to give trust to people who do other things. This is how we work at all times. When you go to the supermarket, you trust that the food is on your shelf because of experts who grew it, who knew what they were doing when they were growing it, experts who transported it across the world to be there, and experts in the supermarket who make sure that the food is safe to put on the shelf and allow you to buy it. You trust for all of that to happen. When you go buy a computer, you trust that it works and that you have no idea how a computer works, what goes on in the silica and the electrodes and all the rest of it. You have no idea how it works, but it works, and you trust that it happens. For some reason, with climate change, there seems to be a lack of trust in the people who are doing the work to say, this is an issue. We should care about it as a global community. We might not know what the solution, the right solution, singular, is, but there's some things we can do to work at it. And so I think that's where we needed to go with stuff like climate change and elsewhere when we're talking about economic policy. When people are saying if you cut taxes on the wealthy, it doesn't lift all boats in most cases. And we have to look at those things and trust the experts who are saying those things. Sure, there are always going to be air quote experts like William Harper, who has a PhD in physics, who somehow is leading the president's now defunct panel on climate change analysis. But just because, that's one person. You got to look at the bigger picture. The vast majority